Hello, my name is Roisin and welcome back to my channel. Hello friends and welcome back to another reading challenge reading vlog. So for today's reading vlog, I am letting the Storygraph decide what I read. So if you don't know, the Storygraph is a new website that has been set up, and it is a place where you can record what books you've read, update your reading progress, add reviews and find recommendations, and you can also follow your friends and see what they're reading. I will leave my Storygraph linked in the description below, as I always do, if you would like to go and follow me on there. It's the first place I update what I'm reading, so you will know ahead of everyone else. Storygraph is an independent website, whereas Goodreads is run by Amazon, so it is kind of a new competition to Amazon, which is what we're supposed to have in capitalism, isn't it? So you can subscribe to this website and they will give you lots of personalized specific recommendations depending on what you're looking for. But even if you don't pay, the Storygraph will still give you personalized recommendations based on books that you have liked reading, I assume. I don't know exactly how it works, but what I'm going to do for this vlog is get 5 books recommended for me off the Storygraph and see how accurate I think their recommendations are. Yep, we are recording. Okay, so here is the recommendations. We're going to explore those recommendations. So the first one we have here is A Lady Cyclist's Guide to Kashgar. Now, I enjoy books that are set outside of the UK, US, generally speaking. This is also historical fiction, which of course I enjoy. This is by Suzanne Joinson. It is 1923. Evangeline English and her sister Lizzie are missionaries heading for the ancient Silk Road city of Kashgar. Though Lizzie is on fire with her religious calling, Eva's motives are not quite as noble. But with her green bicycle and a commission for a publisher to write A Lady Cyclist's Guide to Kashgar, she is ready for an adventure. Nobody I'm following has read this book. It has an average rating of 3.32. I'm going to see if I can find this one at my library or on Scribd. Then we have The Dream of Scipio. Now this cover for The Dream of Scipio looks like something I would not read, would never pick this up, but it is historical fiction, which I do enjoy, and is a mystery, challenging, serious, reflective and slow paced. I think that the Storygraph says that most of the books I read are challenging and slow paced and reflective. A follow-up to the best-selling An Instance of the Finger Post. Now, since this says it is a follow-up and I haven't been recommended the first one, I'm going to say no to that one. Okay, then we have The Philosopher's Flight by Tom Miller, which is fantasy historical, which is something that I really enjoy as kind of an escapist fiction. A thrilling debut from ER doctor turned novelist Tom Miller, The Philosopher's Flight is an epic historical fantasy set in a World War I era America where magic and science have blended into a single extraordinary art. Okay, interesting. Again, no one I know has read this, but it's got an average rating of 4. Adventurous, light-hearted, fast-paced. So not really generally what I would read, but maybe this will take me outside of my comfort zone. Then we have City of Darkness, which is another historical fiction, challenging, informative and slow-paced, which are things that I like. In her most splendid, thought-provoking novel yet, Marge Piercy brings to vibrant life 3 women who play prominent roles in the tumultuous, bloody French Revolution, as well as their more famous male counterparts. So interesting. I recently read A Place of Greater Safety by Hilary Mantell, which was set during the French Revolution. It's not an era of history I know very much about. So we'll see if we can find this one. First published in 1996, so that is interesting to read a slightly older novel. The Odd Woman. Now this looks like it is a classic, which you may know I'm trying to read more classics. I'll leave that video in the card above if you're interested. I've never heard of this. Challenging, reflective and slow-paced. A novel of social realism. The Odd Woman reflects the major sexual and cultural issues of the late 19th century. Unlike the New Woman novels of the era, which challenged the idea that the unmarried woman was superfluous, Gissing satirises that image and portrays women as odd and marginal in relation to an ideal. Interesting. Again, no one I know has read this. And then we have Dreaming in Cuban by Christina Garcia. Fiction, historical, magical realism. My favourite is historical magical realism. Here in the dreamy, bittersweet story of a family divided by the politics and geography by the Cuban Revolution. So yes, that is something that I'm interested in, with a bit of magical realism. We also have here The Salt Roads and Celestial Bodies. Now Celestial Bodies is definitely translated, because it says on the front here that Celestial Bodies was shortlisted for the Man Booker International, which is a prize for translated fiction, winner of the 2019 Man Booker International. In the village of Al-Awafi in Oman, we encounter three sisters: Maya, who marries after heartbreak; Asma, who marries from a sense of duty; and Chocola, who chooses to refuse all offers and await a reunion with the man she loves who has immigrated to Canada. So that's set in Oman. I've never read a book from Oman, and is translated work, which is something that I'm interested in. And then The Salt Roads here by Nalo Hopkinson is fantasy, historical, magical realism. My favourite three things to hear together. Challenging, emotional, reflective, slow-paced. All of the things that I love in a novel. A landmark work by the brilliant young author. The Salt Lodge transports readers across centuries and civilizations as it fearlessly explores the relationship women have with their lovers, their peoples, and the divine. Jean Duval, the ginger-coloured entertainer, struggles with her lover poet Charles Baudelaire. Mare, plantation slave and doctor, both hunger for and dreads liberation. And Thais, a dark-skinned beauty from Alexandria, is impelled to see a glorious revelation as Azil, a being born of hope, unites them all. A Nebula Award nominee. So nobody I follow on this on Storygraph has read any of these books. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 because I already have chosen not to read one of them. So we also have The Female Man by Joanna Russ and The Mandarins by Simone de Beauvoir, which is also translated. So if I can't find any of these 7 on my library and Scribd, then I will consider adding some of these others, but I will get back to you after I've had a look for them. Okay, so I have just been through Scribd and through my library, and I have decided on the 5 that I'm going to read this month. So we have Celestial Bodies by Jokha Alharthi, which is the one that is set in Oman about 3 women, and that is a novel in translation. Then we have A Lady Cyclist's Guide to Kashgar by Suzanne Joinson, which is the one that is in 1923 about a Christian mission and a lady cyclist. Then we have The Odd Woman by George Gissing, which is a classic, and that is a satirization of unmarried women in the Victorian era, dramatizes many key issues relating to class and gender. Then we also have The Salt Roads by Nalo Hopkinson, which is set in 1804, shortly before the Caribbean island of Saint Domingue is renamed Haiti. A group of women gather to bury a stillborn lady. Led by a lesbian healer and a midwife, the women's lamentations innovate vitality and draw Azili, the Afro-Caribbean goddess of sexual desire and love, into the physical world. So that sounds good. And then also The Philosopher's Flight, a novel by Tom Miller, and this is the one that is most outside of my comfort zone because it's like fast-paced science fiction but it is set in the First World War historical time period. So those are the 5 that I'm going to read in June for my challenge. Currently it's May, but I have to have time to reserve those at the library. So hopefully this will be an interesting vlog and Storygraph will know my reading taste. Hello! I've got a new top. Naturellement, les aristochats. I think that was off-tune enough that no one will do me for copyright infringement. I'm feeling quite chaotic because I've just had dinner and my partner brought in lettuce that we were growing in our garden, lovely, to have as a salad with dinner. He forgot to wash it though, and I picked up my fork and there was a tiny, admittedly, slug. There was a tiny slug that I nearly put in my mouth. So I'm very grateful that I did not put it in my mouth and instead screamed and flung it across the room. But yeah, that's the energy I'm bringing to this clip, regardless. So what are we talking about? We're talking about The Philosopher's Flight, which is one of the books the Storygraph recommended me. As you know, you're watching the vlog. So Philosopher's Flight is the kind of sci-fi fantasy book that I was recommended, set at the beginning of the First World War in America, where like magic, witchcraft, has become considered to be a science, and there are schools where you can go to learn it, but there are also people campaigning against it because it's mostly perpetuated by women, and also because women have been under attack for it, and so they have committed acts of violence against people who were committing violence against them, but the retaliation was seen as bad, as worse. You know how that goes. And also in this, the main character is a man, but men don't normally do magic or sigilry, as it's called in this book, but he can, and he wants to join the rescue corps as part of the war effort. Anyway, so there is some bright flashing going on outside. Anyway, so I am about 20% of the way through. I'm listening to the audiobook on script, and I keep being distracted by that flash. I wasn't enjoying it so much to begin with, because it's very much like world building, and it's explaining the magic to me quite a lot. Like, it's explaining how the magic works and what you have to do to create magic and the history of the magic and all of that. And that's not my favourite thing. I don't really like world building. I would rather just be thrown in without any explanation, and let the magic just be. I prefer my magic to be like smaller, unexplained, like not a whole world. So that part of it was kind of boring for me. But now he has got to Radcliffe College and he's met the 5 other women that I'm assuming are going to be the main characters, because some people who can do magic can fly, and him and these other 5 are like the best flyers in the college that he's gone to. So I'm kind of enjoying it more because I like the characters. I think the characters are well developed. The language used evokes the time period well, so I'm enjoying it more now that we kind of got into the plot, but the world building itself isn't for me. I'm intrigued to see where this goes. There are these people called trenchers who are really against magic, and they're like preaching about like women being in the home and not being allowed to do magic and not being educated and things like that, which I think could be saying some quite interesting political things. So whilst I don't think it's ever going to be a favourite book of mine, because like I said, it's not how I prefer my magic systems to be when I do read fantasy, I'm kind of intrigued, looking forward to where it's going to go, and I've got more into it now that I'm 20% of the way through. The other book that I am 20% of the way through is A Lady Cyclist's Guide to Kashgar, and this is a historical fiction set across 2 time periods. One that is modern day, about a kind of disaffected woman who works for a think tank about the Arab world. She's feeling like disconnected. She's been in a relationship with a married man and she's feeling really disconnected from her life, and then all of a sudden this man shows up on her doorstep and paints a picture with all these birds and feathers and a piece of poetry in Arabic. And then we're also back in Kashgar, where there is this woman Millicent who is on a mission, she's not on a mission, no, she's trying to set up a mission in Kashgar in like Central Asia, China, so like near Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, that sort of area, but in China. I think it's part of Kashmir, and she has brought along Lizzie and the main character Eva, and Eva doesn't really believe in the mission, but she wants to write about cycling in Kashgar. I've been through several chapters in either perspective, and so far both characters are coming across as incredibly ignorant about the rest of the world, about the cultures that they are, particularly Arabic and Islamic cultures that they are exploring, and I don't know, I'm considering that maybe it's supposed to be like setting it up as that, and then they're going to like learn the error of their ways as they explore. Feels like very much easy reading so far. There's been some little sparkles of lyrical writing, but mostly it's quite straightforward. And yeah, I'm just not quite sure. I feel like it might be a little gauche, a little heavy-handed in terms of what it's doing, but I don't know yet because I haven't got through any more of it. I'm unsure if this is going to be particularly for me. It feels very like Sunday afternoon women's book club kind of reading, which is not generally what I read or what I enjoy reading. But Storygraph have recommended it to me based on what I've read in the past, and I think they can take ratings into account. I think they're not, you've read loads of these books but given them 1 star, because like with all my challenges and stuff, I've read a lot of books I don't like, because I'm like trying to explore an idea. So we'll see how I get on with the rest of this. I feel like I've started off with the 2 like easiest to read, because we've got a classic, I've got a translated work from Arabic from an Omani writer, and I've got the like magical realist historical fiction, which is probably, if you were to like describe each of them to me, I would probably think the magical realist historical fiction would be my favourite, because that's generally speaking my favourite genre. But yeah, I've started with the 2 like easy reads because I've been feeling not like reading a lot at the moment. I'm not sure why. It has been really hot in the UK and I always feel sicker and more fatigued when I'm hot. Today has been despite the amount of energy I've come into this clip with, has not been a day of energy. I've been like napping most of the day. So it's, yeah, I've been finding it reading a bit hard this month, but I'm going to persevere. I'm going to read the rest of all of these books. I'm sure I will manage to get through them before the end of the month. I'm not worried about that. But I suppose that's not really interesting. We're trying to find out whether this works, whether this Storygraph recommendations work. Anyway, so I will get back to you when I've read a bit more of these books. So I was listening to the audiobook for George Gissing's The Odd Women, and I was finding it enjoyable, slightly amusing, very, very confusing. I couldn't understand what was going on with the plot at all. It jumped forwards in time, and then I thought it was going to go backwards and kind of explain everything. Only for it to then jump back at the exact point that we'd jumped forward, like the split, the sentence, it just didn't make sense again. And so I got the book because I was like, wait, what's going on? It had somehow, the audiobook had interposed chapter 28 into the middle of chapter 4. And so my experience of reading this book is going to be a little confused by that aspect. But I guess I'm going to have to give up the audiobook because I don't know if it's going to keep jumping around or if that's just going to have happened once. Luckily, for a classic, it's an 1890s classic, which means it's a little easier to get through, I think. I think I'm going to be all right with this one. I mean, like, obviously things like Jane Austen I don't have any problem reading. That's straightforward enough for me. But things like Waverley by Sir Walter Scott was a bit confusing for me reading it on the page. So I don't really know what it is about the time periods or whatever that confuses me. This one seems all right though. So I'm gonna get, and also I often struggle with like 1920s and 1930s novels. So yeah, I don't really know, but I'm gonna go and read this in physical copy now because that was super confusing the way it jumped around, and now I feel like I've been spoiled because I know what the ending is, kind of, or part of the ending, because the audiobook was so messed up. So if you want to read The Odd Woman, don't listen to the audiobook on script, even though it's narrated by Juliet Stevenson, who is a great audiobook narrator. Somehow it's got chapter 28 spliced into the middle of chapter 4. Hello. So this is my silk cap for sleeping in, and I wasn't going to talk to you now, but I'm halfway through The Philosopher's Flight, and I'm talking to you because I want to read more, and I always check it halfway. So as you can probably tell from that, I'm really enjoying it now. I'm really, really liking it. Like, I didn't love the first 20% or whatever because of all the setup and the world building. I look ridiculous. Anyway, ignore how ridiculous I look because of all the setup and the world building, which is not my favourite thing. But now that we're actually into it and the characters, I'm really, really enjoying it. I like the characters, a little bit of romance like that. I like what it's saying about politics. I'm really, really enjoying it. Like, it's very, very different from what I normally read in terms of it being like super plotty, fast paced, there's a lot going on, but it does have school as an aspect of it, which I enjoy, like people learning how to do things, secret societies, kind of gender as an idea, and like this persecution stuff. It's really, really good. Well done. Really liking the characters. So, Storygraph. I wasn't convinced, but now I am. I'm convinced about this. Hello. So, I am halfway through A Lady Cyclist's Guide to Kashgar now, and I don't know how I feel about it. The writing isn't 100% my style, but it's not terrible either. There are moments that are quite beautiful, but most of it's fairly plain and straightforward. There was a moment of really bad fat phobia just thrown in there that was really grim, and these two people who are clearly attracted to one another, he keeps describing her as thin. She's thin and small and delicate, she's thin. And then there was this other woman who was this fat piggy police officer who was so fat her legs spilled over the chair. Like, yeah, there are moments when one of the characters, Frida, is talking about Orientalism and how like she has this internalized Orientalism, and she keeps thinking these things about the guy character who's an Arabic character from Yemen. He's a Yemeni character, and she keeps thinking things about him, and she's like, this is Orientalism, I shouldn't be thinking this, but she is thinking it. And I feel like maybe it's a commentary on like, well, it's a commentary on Orientalism, but also that internalized thing, and your first thought being what's like your program to think, etc. And then there's also a lot of Orientalism coming from the like 1900s version part of it as well. And I'm just like, all the Muslim characters in it are kind of being treated like separate and not really humanized and kind of this big horde of scary people. But I don't know if it's going to be commenting on the view of them that way, and that's why, because it's all from her perspective. So it's not like necessarily this is in the books, this is what the author thinks. You know, it's like, this is what the author thinks a English middle class girl who travelled to Kashgar what her experience would be. But that doesn't mean it's the right thing to think, you know. So I'm wondering if it's going to be a commentary on that. I'll have to see. So far it is like very easy reading. I would say there's not much of a, like, it doesn't feel particularly thought-provoking. I'm just sort of unsure about the perspective at the moment. I've also finished The Philosopher's Flight, and I did enjoy that much more than I thought I would. It kind of, I was listening to it and I was thinking it was reminding me of like the lost city of Atlantis meets Chariots of Fire. Like the Disney movie meets Chariots of Fire. There was like a lot of like training montages going on, learning to fly, and I thought that was all quite fun. There was also romance in it that I thought was pretty well done, and the like descriptions of the world and the magic, the way the magic was used in the beginning was very much like world building. I'm annoyed by this, but after that kind of got over that, and it was much more my style with things just happening, although there was a little too much technical description for my personal preference when it comes to fantasy. I really liked the way it was talking about like gender. I think the things that it, like, there were lots of, the main character's a guy and the author's a guy, but there were, most of the characters in it were female, and they were all very different, very complex. Like there was no men writing women like in examples in this. I didn't feel like, I thought it was very well done, and it was, yeah, interestingly commenting on suffrage, the women's suffrage movement, commenting on race, and how that interacted with the women's suffrage movement. The writer has used real historical examples and events, and then added in this magic world to that. And so he's been talking about what women did during the First World War, for example, but with his added magic in it, which is really interesting, well done. And I thought the way that he was discussing the trenches were very much like who were against this magic and want women to be back in the home and everything. It felt like he understood the points that he was trying to make. Nothing felt too clumsily done in terms of fundamentalist Christian stuff that happens in the US currently, and how he was relating that through this sort of historical fantasy setting. I thought was pretty good. It was a lot of fun. It wasn't like going to be my new favourite book or anything like that, but it is exactly the sort of book that I like to read for fun. So I think I will be continuing on in that series, which is good. So far the Storygraph has got one. Good, not great, not my new favourite, but I did definitely enjoy it, and I don't think I would have heard of it otherwise, because I've never heard anyone talking about The Philosopher's Flight before, so that was good. My new tripod is much more cumbersome than my old one, which hopefully means it won't break as easily, but also means I'm not like carrying it around my house. So right now you're propped up on a giant pile of cushions, hang on, and the dishwasher's on in the background, so this is a great vlog clip. I finished the Lady Cyclist's Guide to Kashgar, and I didn't really get on with this very well. It felt very rocky, like, I don't know what's the word I want. It felt very unbalanced, uneven. There were bits of writing that I thought were really quite nice in here, and it tried to tackle ideas of Orientalism and of like othering people in terms of colonialism. Because in the 1920s, this woman goes to Kashgar as part of a mission to try and like civilize the indigenous people of Kashgar. And it kind of mentions it, and then there's also this modern part with this woman who is meeting this Arabic guy, and it kind of talks about how she others him as well, and how she doesn't want to do it because she understands that it's wrong. And it also talks about like think tanks that are trying to talk to the youth of the Arab world, and how like neo-colonialist they are, which were interesting things, but I felt like they were just like sort of barely glanced upon. And then also I never really understood the point of the modern part, like why did that need to be in there? I really feel like if you're doing a dual timeline, the point just can't be, oh, they're related. There has to be a reason why you're putting modern stuff in as well as old stuff, or old stuff in as well as modern stuff. You can't just like throw it in. Her mum and everything, and the story, undocumented immigrant in the UK, it just all felt really pointless. Like there was no need for it. And then even like the Lady Cyclist's Guide to Kashgar, I feel like Suzanne Joinson discovered a book called The Lady Cyclist's Guide to Kashgar, thought that sounded like an interesting title for a book, and then barely used it, because she talks about the main character in the 1925 part being wanting to write this the Cyclist's Guide to Kashgar. She wants to talk about it being like the first British woman to go to Kashgar or whatever. And then there's a part in it where she's like, oh, she had to leave her bike behind, and she's really sad about it. She's like, this is terrible, it's ruining, taking away my freedom. Because I think Suzanne Joinson wanted to talk about how bicycles gave women and working class people more freedom, the ability to transport themselves distances, which they didn't have before. But she doesn't talk about the bike the whole time that they're in Kashgar. She's talking about a baby the whole time. It's all about a baby. It's nothing to do with her bike. And then suddenly we had like, oh, I'm so sad I'm losing my bike. And it's like, you have barely mentioned the fact that you took a bike to Kashgar. You barely cycle anywhere. You stay in the house and look after a baby. That's the whole thing that you do. So yeah, this one, sorry Storygraph, but this one was really a miss for me. Then I'm also halfway through The Odd Women by George Gissing, and I don't know how I feel about this, now that I've sorted out the fact that the audiobook was randomly ordered and I'm reading it with my eyes. It's very readable, it's very easy to get through, which for a classic, I think that this would be a really accessible classic if you weren't used to reading classics, because the language isn't difficult at all, and it's really quite engaging, and I like the characters, and like everything makes sense. There's nothing too confusing going on, like you understand why people are behaving the way they are. And yeah, I really enjoy some of the characters, and I'm liking the story. It's kind of there's this kind of romance going on between this woman who is a new woman and doesn't want to get married, doesn't believe in marriage because she thinks it's a dangerous proposition for women. And then there's this guy who's decided he wants to romance her, but because he wants to like prove whether she really feels that way or not, as kind of an experiment to himself. Like, it's quite good natured. It's not quite Taming of the Shrew levels, but it's funny because he's so clearly infatuated with her, but he's like, no, it's just an experiment. I'm just working it out. So I find that quite amusing. Like, it's definitely got rom-com vibes. The classism is very strong in this book. They like, these women who are trying to improve the lot of women are just like, no, I don't care about the working classes. They're too rough, they're useless. It's like, okay. And then the man is like, they're talking about how, oh, it's kind of good to be a woman in the 1890s because you have a cause, you have a thing you're trying to change, a rights you're trying to gain, and men don't have a purpose in life. And the woman's like, well, men could make their purpose the emancipation of the labouring classes, but who'd want to care about them? Like, very strong classism. And I've read in the notes that George Gissing himself married two working class women and decided that working class women were terrible, and hated them. So that's where that comes from, which is very interesting. So yeah, it's kind of funny and amusing, and I'm enjoying it thus far, but I will have to see how I feel in the future about what it's saying, and I definitely don't enjoy the classism aspect of it. But, you know, Jane Austen obviously didn't care about the working classes because she never mentions the working classes throughout the entirety of her book, but this guy's like actively hating on the working classes. I've also begun The Salt Road by Nalo Hopkinson. I'm about 20% of the way through. I'm finding it a little bit confusing because the audiobook is told from like multiple different perspectives, and the audiobook hasn't changed the voice actor, and the voice actor hasn't really changed her voice, so it takes me a little while to realise which perspective we're in, and everything feels quite similar sometimes, but I think that the writing is really, really beautiful. I'm enjoying that aspect of it, and it's kind of reminding me of The Prophets, which I also read this month in my Queer Lit Readathon vlog. I'll leave in the cards above. But I don't know if that's because it's like set at the same time about queer people, about queer enslaved people, and love during like, and humanity during like horrible, how you find the will to survive and survive all the trauma committed against enslaved people by white people, enslaved black people by white people, and also is magical realist. No, I don't think... No, The Prophets wasn't magical realist, but it had the beautiful writing and a lot of like biblical references and stuff, which this also has references to gods and stuff. They're just not biblical gods. But the gods in The Prophets don't do any intervening. So anyway, I'm enjoying it thus far, but hopefully the different perspectives will balance out a bit more in the future. I look like a hot egg. Not hot as in attractive, like an egg that has been warmed. Anyway, I am halfway through The Salt Roads by Nalo Hopkinson now, and I am enjoying it, but I'm unsure. Like, it could go either way. This could end up being a book that I really, really love, or it could end up being a book that I don't really care for as much, because the writing is beautiful, in a lot of ways, and I think the characters are quite well developed, although only some of them. Like, it's like there's lots of characters, but only a few of them are properly developed. But the thing that's most confusing me is the plot, because as you probably know if you've watched any videos of mine before, I don't mind a book without much of a plot. Like, it's about the slave revolts in Haiti, and there's something about Charles Baudelaire and his mistress, and then there's been this one tiny section set in ancient Greece or in Alexandria, and that's it. It just went away again, and I'm like, I don't know what's supposed to be going on, and this could go really well. It could get really pulled together and be really, really interesting, and really successful. But for the moment, I'm a bit like, I don't know how you're going to pull this off. I think that Nalo Hopkinson writes really beautifully, and I've enjoyed the way that they've brought in like gods and stuff. Although again, there was like a moment with a mermaid, and I'm still like, okay, but where did that come from? What does that mean? Why is that there? And whilst I always like the magic not to be explained, this magic was like giving someone a quest, an important thing they had to do, but I don't understand what the important thing was, or why they had to do it, or why this person specifically was chosen. And so I'm a bit like, okay, this is going to have to do a lot of work in the second half to bring everything together, because it's been incredibly slow moving, but also setting up all these heavy plot points. So I'm just a bit worried about the balance, I think, of the book at the moment. I'm still enjoying it, definitely. Still enjoying it and going to finish it hopefully today, but I will come back and talk to you when I have. Hello, here we are. Let's lock that exposure. I finally worked out how to do that, by the way, so hopefully there will be less flickering going on in my videos, because I've learned how to lock my exposure. So, The Odd Women by George Gissing. I have finished this book now, and I really don't know how I feel about it. I'm really not sure. I wouldn't say that I necessarily had the most enjoyable experience reading this, but it was a really interesting experience. It was an easy read, which is good for a classic. Like I think I mentioned before, I think that like late Victorian classics tend to be a little easier because they're not so archaic in the language, but they're also not doing weird structuralist shit yet. Like, these can be easier, like more accessible reads. But this one it's quite complicated in terms of just how I feel about it. I thought it was going to be a comedy. I'm not sure why I thought that, but I was convinced it was a satire. There are definitely funny aspects, and I do think it's sort of laughing at people who think that they can escape from society, or that they are like above society. Ego, I think, is a big like theme in this, especially among the men, but also among the women. I know that George Orwell said that like this is a beautiful tragic novel in which everybody is suffering from lack of money, and I do think it is interesting to be reading a novel about like the middle classes, and about the lives of people who have been raised with an education and gently bred, but have not got money and are trying to survive without money, or on money that is less than their station suggests they should have, you know, because it's not about the working classes. In fact, this book profoundly does not care about the working classes, or at least the characters in it profoundly do not care about the working classes and say so as much straight away, which makes you already like aware of their limited perspective, which I think possibly was intentional. But yeah, I think actually the major theme of this novel is misogyny. It's about women who are unmarried and the dangers that befall an unmarried woman, but also the fact that that is something that women are going to have to deal with and experience, and like the strictures of society and how badly that affects unmarried women, but also the dangers of marrying just to avoid that fate, because like one of the marriages in here that happens is terrible. The men in this book just want to control women. That's all they care about. Even women that they purport to love and have this fascination with, they still want to have power over them and want these women to submit totally to them. And from reading like the introduction and some of the notes, it seems like that was George Gissing was upset about having unruly women under his thumb as well. So I don't know how much of it is intentional, but it like intentionally critical of these men. But well, one of them it's definitely critical of, but the other one I'm not sure how critical it is being of that character. But you can read it in a critical way. It does allow for that reading, whether the author intended it or not. So it was definitely a really interesting experience. If you are someone who reads Victorian classics and wants to try something a little lesser known, I think this would be an interesting one, because it definitely talks about social mores in late Victorian period when things are changing, and is about a class that I have not often read about when reading novels. I mean, I'm not a huge, like I haven't read a huge amount of classics that aren't super famous, so that is potentially why, but I think class was really interesting in here, and gender was really interesting in here, which are two things that I love reading about. So whilst this wasn't necessarily my favourite book, I'm not like obsessed with it. I do understand why the Storygraph recommended this to me, because I am interested in class and gender in classics. So it's a perfect book in that, perfect recommendation in that way. And it's definitely one that I think could think a lot about. Like if I studied this at university, I feel like you could write a really good essay about it. Like there's a lot to delve into there. So I am glad I read it, and I am glad the Storygraph recommended it to me, even if it's not a novel that I fell in love with. I also finished The Salt Roads by Nalo Hopkinson, and it did come together for me in the end, which I'm really glad about. I did end up enjoying it. Like I'd said all the way through, it was really, really beautiful, but I wasn't really sure why these women were connected, other than the fact that they were all enslaved, two like specific, like explicitly enslaved, the other one in a like dependence relationship because she was mixed race and in France in the 1850s, and also the daughter of a sex worker and a sex worker herself. So there was a dependence on Charles Baudelaire and on other men throughout her life. It was definitely a difficult read in places. It did not shy away from the brutality of slavery, and I know a little bit about the Haitian slave rebellions. I know that Haiti was the like first independent nation of enslaved people. I don't know a lot about the specifics. Women's section I thought was potentially the weakest section. It was definitely the slimmest section. It didn't exist as much throughout, and I was a little unsure why it was added, except I suppose to talk about, it was talking about Exili and the voodoo pantheon of gods. So it was talking about Afro-Caribbean gods, and I think that Meritet, who was the character from the ancient Roman part, who I think it was a relation to how Christianity affected Africa throughout history, and how it was involved in the enslaving of people, and also about how stories are told about you that are not what you have chosen, that are not your real life, that people who have more power will take control of your story. Overall, I thought the characters were brilliant, and I thought it was really well written. I really loved Jean and Mère. I thought they were brilliant characters, and a really complex, interesting character. I liked the way that it played with gods and the idea and used voodoo as a part of the narrative. It's kind of a novel that you have to like go with. You have to go with the flow whilst reading. You can't like try and sit down and perfectly plot out or understand exactly what's happening. I was never completely confused in terms of what was happening in each section, just the linking of them and the reasoning for it. But in the end, I did enjoy it. There were parts that I felt were weaker, for example, the ancient Roman part, and sometimes when it felt it tended a little into the overwrought, but for the most part, I thought it was really, really good, and I definitely enjoyed it. I would recommend it. It just isn't going to be a new favourite book, but I thought it was really well written. And also, I definitely think it's going to be one of those books that stays with me. I have also started Celestial Bodies by Jokha Alharthi, and so far, I think I know what's going on. It's flashing between multiple different perspectives, but I'm having trouble remembering who each of the characters is, because they're being introduced in such small parts and then they'll reappear in another part, and I've not quite got the timeline set in my head. But I'm only about a quarter of the way through. There's still, and it's a very short book, so I'm not very far through at all. There's still loads of this to go. So far, the writing again is very simplistic, and This is a problem that I have a lot with translated fiction. I say that that's the fault of the writer because it could just be the fault of the translation. I'm still working out how to review translated fiction because I feel like it's so hard to know what is the writer, what is the book itself, and what is because of the translation. Obviously, I have to review it as a whole work. There are things that are lost in translation, like if the Arabic would be beautiful in a way that the English feels repetitive. For example, one of the characters was described as so pretty and cute, and it just felt, why would you need both of those words? Although they are not exact synonyms, I feel like that it's unnecessary to have both, but perhaps the words in Arabic had a slightly more differentiation between them. Maybe cute's more about personality and action than looks in Arabic, like the word that was being used, and we don't have a synonym for it in English. Things like that make it hard for me to know how to review a translated work. But I'm going to keep reading this. This is the last book, and so hopefully I'll get back to you later with a big review sum up of this whole experience. Hello again. So now I am about halfway through Celestial Bodies, and I'm definitely more interested in the story than I was to begin with. Partly because I kind of know who everyone is now and how they're related to each other, so I'm starting to understand the story more. I feel like it's a lot about what it's like to be a woman in Oman, particularly. The grandfather in this had owned slaves, and slavery was ended in Oman in 1970, I think. So set in the 70s and 80s-ish. And it's about three sisters, but then also other women. One of them was one of these grandfathers' enslaved women, and one of them was her son's wife and her mother, who is mentally unwell and so has been locked in a room. So it's very much about the plight of women in Oman, I guess. Strictures and the confines that were on women in Oman in the 1970s. The only thing is that I'm not 100% getting along with it because it feels very disconnected and almost cold in the way that it's written. And as I was saying earlier, I don't know how much of that is down to the translation and how much of it is down to the writer herself. I guess I feel disconnected from it. I don't feel particularly drawn into it. There are some moments of quite nice writing, but for the most part, it doesn't really work for me, which is a shame. I'm going to finish it and maybe it will turn around and I'll feel a lot better about it in the future. But because I've only got, I'm halfway through this, it's not a big book, so it will just take me another hour and a half, I guess. And then we'll wrap this thing up. Hello, so I have now finished Celestial Bodies, and I promise it is later in the day and I have actually read this book. I'm not coming all at once in the day, but I did read it basically just today and yesterday. And what I said before stands. The story was interesting. I was really intrigued to learn more about Omani culture, and about, it was really interesting the way that it explored the constrictions on women in particular, but also how those constrictions play about with men as well, the very restrictive nature of the culture in Oman, and also the way that it talked about slavery, which Oman was one of the last countries in the world to outlaw slavery, and but it's still considered to be quite bad for slavery now, modern slavery. Aspects that were a little magical kind of almost thrown in there, voices, chorus voices, which I always enjoy in books. So I did like it, but I didn't love it because, as I was saying, it felt quite disconnected and distant from me. I always enjoy books told from multiple different perspectives, but none of the perspectives in this really had much warmth to them. And whilst I don't have to like characters to enjoy a book, there has to be something that draws me to them. So I feel like I'm not just being told their story without experiencing their personality or who they are as an individual, which I don't know if that's what this book was aiming for, but I just enjoy books with more developed characters. So I read 5 books there that Storygraph recommended to me to see what I thought of their recommendation, and I think that they have done a decently good job of recommendations. I did notice that when I added new books, it didn't really change my recommendations, but I used the free Storygraph service, and maybe it would be more specific if I didn't. The books that I read there, then, I read The Philosopher's Flight by Tom Miller, and I really enjoyed that book, which I wasn't at all expecting would be too sci-fi-y for me, but it wasn't. And it started off a little too much in the world building, but I guess it's the first book in a series, and I suppose that's where the world building happens. I prefer books that don't do that and just plonk you straight in. I don't need to be explained everything. but I kind of enjoyed the tone of this book. I thought the characters were really good. Didn't do the men writing women thing, which, you know, the Twitter of men writing women. It didn't do that at all. All of the women were so complex and nuanced and different from one another, which I thought was really strong. And whilst that shouldn't be like amazing for a male writer, I thought that it was really well done, and I really, really enjoyed it. And I think I'm going to read the next ones in the series. It was exactly my kind of like escapist fun fiction. I like the way that it dealt with like topics of kind of extremist political reactions to women gaining power and things like that. I thought it did a really good, interesting comment on that. I really appreciated that from a like light, wonderful fantasy book. Then I also read A Lady Cyclist Guide to Kashgar, and I would say that was probably the most disappointing and the least me out of all of those books. I just felt like it was very meh, blah, boring. I didn't understand why these two stories were being connected, what the point of them being in the same book together was. I tried to deal with some topics. It did like broach the topic of neocolonialism, old colonialism of the missionary thing, but it felt very like it was tentative and not really going into that very much. The whole cycling thing felt really randomly plonked in and didn't seem to connect it to the story. I didn't feel like any of the characters really, their motivation made any sense. Yeah, that one was definitely the most disappointing, and I can see why it was recommended to me, because I read a lot of historical fiction and I like historical fiction that's really literary and really dense, but I do also enjoy aspects of historical fiction as my sort of lighter escapist reading sometimes, but I find that that's very difficult line to walk. And so that one was like the bum note out of all of these, because all of the rest of them I can be like, well, you can't really tell exactly how well the style of writing, for example, is going to jive with someone. I also read The Odd Women by George Gissing, probably the most unusual book, and one that I'm sort of, I wouldn't say I'm the gladdest I read this one, because The Salt Roads and Philosopher's Flight I'm glad I read as well, but this one was entirely not what I was expecting and really opened me up to a different view on like Victorian classics, because I've never read any other ones that were like this, that gave me so much to think about. So accessible, such an easy read, but also so much to think about, considering like gender and class, which are things that I love to read in books. Like, I think if you like Elizabeth Gaskell, like North and South kind of classics, I think you would like this, even though it's not got the same like beautiful love story that you get from North and South. It's not as escapist as that, but in terms of the way it talks about class and like interactions between class, the way it talks about money, the way it talks about gender, in particular, I think that this is a really interesting classic to read. You wouldn't necessarily fall in love with it, but if you want to read something to think about those things and think about perspectives of gender in late Victorian England, this would be a book that I think would be worth reading. Then I also read The Salt Roads by Nalo, Hopkinson, and I really enjoyed that. Whilst it did have some parts that I didn't think were as strong and some characters that I didn't feel were fully fleshed and rounded out, I could have just had it be the two sections of in France and in Haiti. In fact, I could have just had it all be in Haiti. All of the characters there were, I think, the strongest, and that's potentially because we spent the most time with them. It was very, very beautifully written, and I will definitely be looking up some of Nalo Hopkinson's other works. So I do think the Storygraph recommendations do seem to be pretty good. Not perfect, but I don't think anyone's going to recommend you books that you always love. I'm sure if you vibe with the things that I like most of the time, you will also have read some stuff I like and been like, what? This is rubbish. So I did have a really good time doing this vlog, and I'm really pleased because I feel like their recommendations are a little out of left field. Like, they're a bit weirder than some of the other recommendations I would expect. Like, these are not, well, apart from Celestial Bodies, which won the International Booker and I have seen around, these are not books that I've like heard a lot of people talking about. They are not books that I see a lot on recommendations lists, and so I think that that's really cool that they're like promoting some slightly lesser known or less hyped books, because things like The Salt Roads by Nalo Hopkinson, if it was released now, I think would have a lot of hype on BookTube, for example, but it's from 2003, I think, so it's pre-YouTube. So I think that maybe people don't necessarily know about it because a lot of us get our bookish information from the internet. Maybe I'm speaking out of my arse and it is a really famous book and I have just managed to avoid it, but I do think that it is a sort of book that would get a lot of hype if it came out now, and I would be aware of it had it come out now. Obviously I wasn't aware of it when I was 10. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed coming along with me on this journey. Sign up for the Storygraph. I will leave it in the description if you aren't already, and you can follow me. I will leave my Storygraph down there as well. If you did enjoy this video, I will leave another vlog here if you would like to go and watch some more of me doing some difficult reading challenges and seeing how many books I can fit into my time. And if you aren't subscribed, I would really appreciate it if you did. I'll put a button right here where you can do so. I put out new videos 3 times a week, usually every Wednesday, Friday and Sunday, though I know this came out on a Saturday, so there you go. But I've tried my best, and hopefully I will see you again very, very soon. Bye bye.